The roses at Willowbrook Plantation bloomed in defiance of nature, their crimson petals pushing through even the coldest Virginia winters between 1847 and 1850. Travelers from Richmond to Charleston came to marvel at their beauty, never suspecting the grim secret lying beneath the soil, a secret that cost the lives of 11 young women and consumed one widow with madness. Hidden away in the basement of the Henrico County Courthouse, forgotten ledgers and medical reports reveal a story so unsettling that historians left it untouched for nearly 2 centuries. These records trace a chilling pattern of grief and obsession, a descent so dark it challenges every idea we have about love loss and the desperate need to preserve what time always steals away. Before we uncover the twisted legacy of Evangeline Crowe and her haunted garden, take a moment to subscribe and share where you're listening from, because it's your support that allows these long-buried nightmares to finally come into the light. Willowbrook stretched across 800 acres of prime tobacco country, its great white-columned house a monument to wealth since Jeremiah Crowe built it in 1798. For decades, it weathered war, hardship, and change, holding its reputation as one of the most prosperous estates in Virginia. But by 1847, shadows had fallen over its manicured grounds. Evangeline Fairfax had married Jeremiah Young, bringing not only wealth, but an uncanny gift for gardening. A Richmond-born socialite with a refined education, she lived for the soil. Her roses grew fuller, her vegetables richer, her flowering trees bloomed out of season, earning her a reputation across the South. Servants whispered of her odd habits, speaking to her plants in hushed tones, mourning wilted blossoms as if they were kin. Still, her gentle spirit and kindness earned loyalty among the household. That fragile peace shattered one bitter February morning when Jeremiah collapsed from a sudden heart attack in his tobacco storehouse. His death drew mourners from miles around, remembering him as a rare fair man in an unfair age. Evangeline's grief, however, was bottomless. Witnesses remembered her lingering at his grave long after others left, scattering the petals of her wedding bouquet onto the dirt. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, the family physician, later wrote that in the weeks following, she seemed to vanish into herself, speaking rarely, her voice little more than a whisper. It was during this silence that her fixation on beauty and her terrifying refusal to accept decay first began to show. Evangeline Crowe's descent began with quiet, deliberate choices that few questioned at first. She dismissed most of the plantation's field workers, claiming she could no longer afford them, but curiously kept every house servant young women, all between 16 and 25. At the same time, her garden expanded with a frenzy that bordered on obsession. She ordered rare seeds, exotic soils, and strange tonics from Charleston, Savannah, and beyond, spending hours in the dirt with a restless energy that unsettled those around her. At first, the change was subtle, the kind of slow unraveling that only those closest to her could sense. But by the fall of 1847, it was impossible to ignore. Her grief had hardened into something dangerous, something that seemed to demand payment from those within her reach. Martha Henley, the trusted housekeeper, would later tell investigators about the moment she first felt real fear. It was during the October pruning of the roses. Where Evangeline had once nurtured her plants with delicate care, she now hacked at them with reckless intensity, slashing away not only dead growth, but strong living branches as well. When Martha nervously suggested such violence could ruin the plants, Evangeline turned on her, her eyes blazing. "Death feeds life." "Martha," she whispered, the words rolling off her tongue like scripture. "Everything beautiful requires sacrifice." The first sacrifice came just weeks later. In November of 1847, 17-year-old Sarah Caldwell collapsed in the rose garden after a day of back-breaking labor. Sarah was the daughter of Irish immigrants who had fled the potato famine, a girl known for her cheer and resilience. But in the final weeks of her life, she had been pushed to exhaustion, hauling water before dawn, mixing heavy soil treatments, working by lamplight long into the night. When Dr. Hartwell arrived, Sarah was already gone. His notes described her body as malnourished and utterly depleted. The most disturbing detail was her hands stained a deep unnatural crimson, not from blood but from a substance the doctor could not identify. The household expected grief or perhaps guilt from their mistress, but what they saw instead was a strange detachment. Evangeline peppered the servants with questions about Sarah's last words. Her final breath, even the way her body had fallen to the earth, as though she were taking notes for some grim experiment. When Martha suggested calling the sheriff, Evangeline's tone sharpened into cold authority. "Sarah died serving this household faithfully," she announced. "She will rest on Crow land, and no outsiders will intrude upon our grief." 3 days later, Sarah was laid to rest in the family cemetery. But that night, servants spied their mistress in the moonlight, digging into the fresh earth and carrying heavy baskets of soil to the rose beds. By morning, Martha confronted her, horrified by what she had seen. Evangeline did not deny it. Instead, she laid her hand on a swollen rosebud and said softly, almost tenderly, "The soil where Sarah rests has been sanctified by her devotion. Her life force will nourish the garden in ways she never could in life." Evangeline Crowe called it the most beautiful tribute she could offer Sarah Caldwell's memory. But the notes Dr. Samuel Hartwell left behind decades later told a far darker truth. His examination revealed that Sarah had not simply collapsed from overwork on a cold November morning. Her body bore clear signs of deliberate deprivation, a systematic depletion that pointed to weeks of enforced exhaustion and starvation. More disturbing still were his observations of Mrs. Crowe at the girl's deathbed. Instead of grief, he recorded her unseemly curiosity as she measured the slowing pulse, the fading breath, and even the final position of Sarah's body with the precision of a scientist. Hartwell's suspicions grew sharper when he tried to collect a sample of the strange crimson substance staining the girl's hands. Evangeline's reaction was explosive. She nearly struck him, declaring that Sarah's essence must remain undisturbed within the plantation grounds. She dismissed the matter by calling it a special fertilizer of her own invention. But her refusal to allow scientific examination spoke volumes. In the weeks that followed, Willowbrook's roses erupted into a frenzy of growth. Against every natural law, they bloomed fuller and more fragrant as winter deepened, drawing admiration from all who visited. Guests marveled at their silk-like petals, so deeply red they seemed to verge on black, and their perfume so heavy it caused some ladies to faint. Yet beneath that beauty lay the stolen life of a girl whose body had been broken to feed the soil. For Evangeline, Sarah's death had not been tragedy. It had been revelation. She began to speak of something she called life essence, convinced that beauty could be preserved, even amplified if properly nourished by sacrifice. What began with one servant quickly hardened into a pattern. By the early months of 1848, the mistress of Willowbrook viewed her remaining housemaids not as girls, but as resources specimens to be observed, tested, and consumed in service of her garden. Martha Henley, the loyal housekeeper, watched with growing dread as her mistress imposed efficiency measures. At first they seemed harsh but ordinary, longer workdays, lighter meals to prevent sluggishness. But soon came something more sinister, what Evangeline called vital essence work. Before dawn, the young women were forced into the icy gardens for hours of brutal labor. They carried heavy buckets of a thick, foul-smelling mixture from the basement, spreading it carefully at the roots of each rose bush and kneeling to claw it deep into the frozen earth with their bare hands. While they worked, Evangeline paced between them, a leather-bound journal in hand, recording every detail of their fatigue, their skin tone, even the tremors in their fingers. To the servants, it was torment. To their mistress, it was Dada. The roses flourished, and with each impossible bloom, her hunger for life essence only grew. Evangeline's obsession deepened with every passing week, her journals filling with notations that made the servants shudder. She tracked the girls' breathing patterns, the pallor or flush of their cheeks, the tremor in their hands, and something she called their vital emanations, as if their very life force could be measured and harvested. Fatigue, instead of being a warning sign, became something she sought out. Anyone who showed weakness was driven harder, as though exhaustion itself had value to her roses. The second death came on a frigid January morning in 1848. 19-year-old Rebecca Marsh collapsed during one of the grueling pre-dawn shifts. A local girl with a widowed mother and 3 younger siblings, depending on her wages, Rebecca had been visibly fading for weeks. Martha Henley tried to intervene, but Evangeline silenced her with talk of building constitutional strength through graduated exertion, as if she were training animals instead of human beings. Dr. Hartwell's findings mirrored those of Sarah Caldwell's case malnourishment exhaustion, and once again the disturbing crimson stains on her hands and clothing. But what unsettled him most was Evangeline's conduct as Rebecca lay dying. She hovered at the bedside, scribbling notes, peppering him with questions about pulse strength, respiration, and the exact progression of organ failure. When he suggested a minister be summoned, she flatly refused, saying any outside presence would contaminate the observations. Rebecca was buried on Crow land, just as Sarah had been, and once again the servants whispered of their mistress creeping into the cemetery at midnight to haul soil back to her roses. This time, however, the horror deepened. While cleaning the girls' quarters, Martha stumbled upon a diary hidden beneath loose floorboards. Its pages told the truth Rebecca had endured in her final weeks, hours spent mixing harsh fertilizers barehanded until her skin blistered meals deliberately withheld to test her stamina, and the dreaded vitality assessments in the basement of the main house. In those sessions, Rebecca wrote Mrs. Crowe weighed and measured them like livestock, noting their pulse temperature and physical responses with chilling detachment. She watches us like we ain't people anymore. Rebecca scrawled in one entry, her writing weak and uneven. Like we're things to be used up for them roses. I seen how she looks at us when we're working, like she's calculating something terrible. God help us all. Ain't none of us going to survive whatever she's planning. The most damning passage described the basement itself. According to Rebecca, it had been transformed into a grotesque laboratory. Scales, charts, and rows of glass bottles lined the shelves, some filled with liquids in shades from golden amber to a thick blood-dark crimson. Labels bore the names of servants past and present. Sarah's bottle was there, along with others Rebecca didn't recognize. How many girls has she done this to, she wrote, and what's she planning with all them bottled? Martha, terrified of what would happen if such a diary were discovered by the wrong eyes, burned it the same night she found it. But she copied key passages into her own private records, a desperate attempt to preserve the truth. By then she knew what no one dared speak aloud. Evangeline Crowe wasn't just grieving. She was experimenting. 2 young women were already dead, and the pattern was only beginning. Within the rigid world of Willowbrook, where Evangeline Crowe's word was law, the servants had no recourse, no protector, and no hope of escape. Martha Henley felt the crushing weight of this reality each day, praying desperately that someone from the outside would see past the rose's beauty and uncover the nightmare festering behind them. But as the winter of 1847 gave way to spring, the danger only deepened. The roses bloomed with a brilliance never before seen. Thick velvet petals in impossible shades. Perfume that seemed to saturate the very air, and visitors from across the South flocked to marvel at the spectacle. To the world, Willowbrook appeared a paradise. Only Martha and the 7 surviving girls knew it was a prison. By April of 1848, the rose garden had grown into a sprawling 2-acre labyrinth, winding paths cutting between beds of increasingly exotic blooms. Evangeline was no longer content with quiet experiments. She corresponded with botanists in London and Paris, sending meticulous notes on her cultivation methods, though carefully omitting the grim foundation of her success. At home, her journals became the blueprint for something darker. She had begun sorting the girls into what she called constitutional categories, as though they were specimens in a study. Some were assigned to morning vitality work, others to afternoon essence cultivation, while a select few bore the ominous designation of intensive preparation. Catherine Walsh, 20 years old and sharp-minded, was one of those chosen. Her literacy, a skill that set her apart from the others, had drawn Evangeline's attention early. It seemed a blessing at first, but soon became a curse. From her first day in intensive preparation, Catherine was required to report at 4 a.m. to the basement laboratory. What she found there turned her stomach. The space had been refashioned into a grotesque fusion of science and sorcery. Anatomical charts pinned beside botanical illustrations, rows of strange instruments polished to a surgical gleam, and chalkboards scrawled with dense equations that only Evangeline herself seemed to understand. Glass bottles of liquid ranging in color from pale amber to near black crimson lined the shelves like grim trophies. Evangeline greeted Catherine each morning with a terrifying mixture of maternal warmth and fanatical conviction. "My dear, your role in our work is vital," she would say, in her gentle, almost sing-song cadence. "One day, future generations will thank us for what we've begun here." The tasks themselves were designed to grind Catherine's body into weakness, hauling heavy containers of the pungent fertilizer mixture, tending roses in cramped positions until her muscles screamed, and submitting to daily assessments. These examinations measured every beat of her pulse, every fluctuation of her skin temperature, every tremor in her breath. Evangeline's journals swelled with the data, each page a testament to her obsession. But it was during these sessions that Catherine glimpsed the full scale of her mistress's madness. Evangeline spoke at length about what she called life transference. Her conviction that vitality could be extracted from one body and redirected into another. She twisted centuries-old medical theories, citing misread passages about blood circulation and nerve conduction as proof. The ancients understood what we have forgotten, she would explain while adjusting one of her crude instruments. Life itself is a substance, my dear. It can be harvested, concentrated, and poured into something greater. Her eyes glowed with zeal as she said it, and Catherine realized with a cold, sinking dread that she was no longer being treated as a servant. She was a subject in an experiment whose purpose she did not yet fully understand, but whose outcome she feared could only end in death. Evangeline Crowe no longer spoke of grief or memory. She spoke of revelation. "My roses have shown me the truth," she told Catherine during one of their dawn sessions. "Each bloom is not just a flower, but the living proof of a great principle, the transfer of human vitality into botanical form. Beauty drawn directly from sacrifice." Her conviction was absolute, her tone serene, as if she were discussing a natural law rather than the calculated ruin of young lives. While Evangeline spiraled deeper into her obsession, Dr. Samuel Hartwell pursued the shadows of truth with growing urgency. The mounting deaths among Willowbrook's servants could no longer be explained as coincidence. Each girl showed the same wasting symptoms, the same physical depletion, and the same crimson stains that defied medical classification. Hartwell began piecing together the pattern in secret, careful to disguise his suspicions, for he knew that confronting Evangeline outright would only tighten her defenses, and her defenses were formidable. By the summer of 1848, Evangeline had built a wall of credibility around herself. She had perfected her explanations, weaving references to agricultural journals and scientific papers into her conversations with disarming ease. She produced forged medical records attesting to the excellent health of her staff, and she cultivated allies among Richmond's elite, who were eager to be associated with the miracle garden of Henrico County. To anyone beyond the plantation gates, Mrs. Crowe was not a monster, but a visionary. Hartwell's breakthrough came not in the garden, but in the archives of the Virginia Historical Society. Buried among colonial records, he found testimony from a 1700s witchcraft case involving a woman named Mercy Fairfax, Evangeline's great-grandmother. Though the charges had been dismissed thanks to the Fairfax family's influence, the accusations were chillingly familiar. Neighbors claimed Mercy kept a garden of impossible beauty, one nourished by the untimely deaths of young servant women. Witnesses testified that each death was followed by blooms of extraordinary splendor. The parallels to Willowbrook were too precise to ignore. Armed with this history, Hartwell began to document everything with meticulous care. He arrived at Willowbrook unannounced, noting the hollow cheeks and trembling hands of the remaining servants. He tried again and again to collect samples of the crimson substance, but Evangeline grew increasingly adept at deflecting him. Her roses, now bursting with otherworldly vigor, seemed to mock his efforts. To the public, she was a genius. Newspapers praised her for what they called a horticultural revolution, claiming her work could change the face of American agriculture. Visitors arrived daily, swooning over the velvet petals and intoxicating perfume, their admiration insulating Evangeline from any suspicion. But within the basement laboratory, Catherine Walsh saw the truth. Each dawn she endured the weight of heavy containers, the sting of chemical burns, and the invasive measurements that stripped her humanity away piece by piece. She saw the gleam in her mistress's eyes as notes were scrawled into leather-bound journals, and she understood what others could not. This was not science. It was ritual obsession and madness woven together under the guise of progress. By midsummer, Catherine could feel her body weakening. Her arms trembled under the weight of the fertilizer buckets, her breath came shorter with each session, and her hands burned with the same stains that had marked Sarah and Rebecca before her. And as the Virginia heat scorched the land, withering even the strongest tobacco crops, Willowbrook's roses continued to flourish as if fed by something deeper than soil and water. Catherine realized with terrible clarity that her mistress's garden had chosen its next sacrifice, and that sacrifice was her. By the summer of 1848, Willowbrook Plantation was no longer just a home, it was a destination. Horticulturalists, society ladies, and curious travelers flocked from up and down the eastern seaboard to marvel at what the Richmond Inquirer breathlessly hailed as the eighth wonder of the agricultural world. Evangeline Crowe basked in the praise, her roses swelling with impossible size and color, their perfume heavy in the air like incense at an altar. Yet beneath the applause and admiration, a darker rhythm pulsed through the estate, a rhythm only Catherine Walsh had begun to perceive. The disappearances came gradually, like clockwork in a cycle only their mistress understood. In June, it was Anna Kowalski, a Polish immigrant, who had arrived in Richmond with her family after fleeing political turmoil. Evangeline placed her in deep cultivation, demanding 12-hour days kneeling in the soil around the estate's oldest roses, bare hands clawing through dirt until they bled. After 3 weeks of this torment, Anna collapsed among the very blooms she had tended, her body crumpled like a discarded stem. July claimed Mary O'Brien, a lively red-haired Irish girl whose laughter had once been the music of the servants' quarters. Evangeline assigned her to essence extraction, a task that required direct handling of the concentrated crimson mixtures that no one else dared touch. The substance stained Mary's hands and arms until it seemed to sink into her very flesh. By the time Dr. Hartwell examined her, her skin bore burns so severe he wondered privately how she had survived for as long as she did. By August, only 4 young women remained, and Catherine could no longer dismiss the truth. The deaths were not accidents. They were orchestrated sacrifices timed to coincide with the peak blooming of different rose varieties. Each life fed a cycle of flowering, each death carefully measured against the size, color, and fragrance of a new wave of roses. Evangeline wasn't simply grieving. She was conducting a grotesque experiment with human lives as her variables. The realization struck Catherine hardest the day she was sent to fetch instruments from what her mistress called the research archive. For years that room had been locked barred to all but Evangeline. But when Catherine turned the key and stepped inside, she found herself in the heart of madness, disguised as science. The walls were plastered with charts, cold clinical diagrams, mapping servant deaths against the garden's productivity. Each date corresponded to a bloom cycle, each girl's physical measurements meticulously cross-referenced with the size and vibrancy of rose petals. Anatomical sketches filled another wall, tracing what Evangeline believed were the invisible pathways through which human vitality could be transferred into plant life. At the center stood a table lined with glass bottles. Catherine's breath caught as she read the labels. Names she knew, names she had thought lost to time, each containing varying amounts of the crimson substance. Some bottles were nearly empty, suggesting their contents had long since been poured into the soil. Others remained half full, their donors having endured drawn-out extractions. With sickening clarity, Catherine realized these were not relics, but trophies, proof of lives harvested for the garden's unnatural perfection. Then she found the journal. Written in Evangeline's precise, elegant hand, it explained everything not as confession, but as justification. Page after page described her methods, her measurements, and her philosophy. She was not, in her own mind, a murderer. She was a pioneer. She believed she had unlocked a fundamental law of nature, a process by which the vitality of one life could be redirected to sustain and perfect another. To her, each death was not cruelty, but progress, each rose a triumph of science over decay. For Catherine, the words confirmed what she already feared: the garden would never be satisfied, and neither would its mistress. Evangeline's journal left no room for doubt. Her words dripped with self-justification, cloaking horror in the language of art and science. The ignorant masses see only death, where I see transformation, one entry declared. Each of these simple creatures achieves in death a nobility they could never have reached in life. Their essence, properly harvested, creates beauty that endures long after their suffering is forgotten. I am not a murderer, but an artist working with the most precious medium of all life itself. But what chilled Catherine Walsh most was not the rhetoric, it was the precision. The journal outlined a timeline, a series of sacrifices that would culminate in what Evangeline called the Great Blooming. According to her calculations, the garden's ultimate perfection required the essence of 15 young women applied in alignment with lunar cycles and seasonal shifts. 11 were already gone. 4 remained. and Catherine's name appeared at the very end of the list, marked for the final essence extraction, the crowning act of Evangeline's grisly masterpiece. Just as Catherine thought she had uncovered the full measure of her mistress's obsession, she found something even darker. Hidden beneath the laboratory notes, a bundle of letters. They revealed that Evangeline was not working in isolation. She had been corresponding with scientific institutions across America and Europe, presenting her work as pioneering horticultural research. She carefully disguised the true source of her data, but shared results in painstaking detail. One prestigious society in London had even invited her to present her findings at their annual conference. The sacrifices of Willowbrook's servants were being alchemized not only into roses, but into reputation, prestige, and international recognition. Worse still, the correspondence showed how carefully Evangeline had shielded herself from suspicion. She had allies in Richmond's social circles, physicians willing to vouch for her, and even academics who praised her for her revolutionary approach to life force cultivation. A letter from a Harvard botanist expressed excitement at her methods and begged for further details, his words dripping with admiration. To the outside world, Evangeline was no madwoman. She was a visionary. Her crimes had been laundered into scientific progress. Dr. Hartwell, for all his suspicions, was already outmaneuvered. Evangeline had tracked his movements, anticipating his inquiries, and she had built a protective wall of credibility around herself so that any accusations could be dismissed as professional envy. Even if Catherine escaped, even if she managed to tell her story, would anyone believe her? Or would the world dismiss her words in favor of Evangeline's polished image as a genius of southern horticulture? The roses glowed blood red in the high heat of summer. Their petals so luminous they seemed lit from within. Visitors called them miraculous, mesmerizing, a glimpse of the divine. Catherine knew better. Each bloom was a death made visible, a life distilled into color and fragrance. She read the journal again and again, her fear growing heavier with every word. The next phase was to begin with the autumn harvest. Her name was marked. Her time was nearly gone. By the autumn of 1849, the roses of Willowbrook had become Virginia's most celebrated wonder. But Catherine Walsh knew they were nothing more than tombstones disguised in velvet petals. Each bloom glowed with the stolen life of a young woman, and now she alone remained the last servant in a house that had been transformed into a laboratory of death. Delegations of botanists arrived from Boston, Philadelphia, even New York, eager to witness Evangeline Crowe's so-called horticultural miracle. They marveled at the impossible blooms, unaware that every rose was watered with blood. For 18 months, Catherine had survived by becoming indispensable, feeding Evangeline's obsessions with detailed notes, assisting in her experiments, and masking her own terror behind the appearance of strength. She had endured while others were worked to death, burned, starved, and broken. But when she found the final essence extraction protocol in her mistress's study, she realized her reprieve was over. Her name stood at the top of the list, marked for 3 weeks of starvation, exhaustion, and measured draining, all culminating in a lunar eclipse on November 3rd. Evangeline believed the eclipse would amplify the transference, creating what she called the Great Blooming, a display that would secure her legacy as the greatest botanical innovator in history. The notes were clinical, detached, horrifying. Catherine was described as primary subject. Her physical robustness praised her stress responses, noted as psychologically optimal. Evangeline had been watching her like an experiment in a cage, anticipating every move, every flicker of resistance. Hidden observation points throughout the mansion ensured Catherine was never truly alone. Escape was impossible, and yet her fears sharpened into resolve. If she could not flee, she could still fight in the only way left, by preserving the truth. Using the very skills Evangeline had cultivated, record-keeping, data compilation, meticulous observation, Catherine began to create a hidden archive of evidence. She documented each death, each grotesque experiment, every page of the journals she was forced to assist with. She concealed fragments of her testimony in places her mistress would never think to look, between the pages of forgotten ledgers, tucked into the seams of old upholstery, hidden beneath loose boards in the servants' quarters. If she died, her story would remain waiting for discovery. And Catherine had one glimmer of hope. Thomas Hartwell, the eldest son of Dr. Samuel Hartwell, had returned from medical training in Philadelphia. Unlike his father, whose investigations had been discredited and neutralized by Evangeline's powerful allies, Thomas was untainted by local politics. Catherine believed that if she could pass even a fragment of her evidence to him, the truth might finally take root beyond Willowbrook's cursed soil. The roses outside blazed with crimson glory, enchanting visitors who spoke of miracles. But inside the house, Catherine prepared for her final weeks, knowing that every step, every breath, was already written in her mistress's schedule. The only question that remained was whether her death would serve only Evangeline's great blooming, or whether it might also plant the seeds of her downfall. On the night of October 20th, the facade finally cracked. Thomas Hartwell's discreet visits had already stirred suspicion within Evangeline. But Catherine's discovery that her carefully hidden documents had been read and mocked in her mistress's latest journal entries sealed her fate. The confrontation that Catherine had feared and secretly prepared for arrived far sooner than the eclipse. The basement laboratory had been staged like a theater for the final act. Bottles filled with the crimson essence of the dead shimmered in candlelight, their arrangement forming a grotesque geometry around the central table where straps and iron fittings awaited Catherine. Every wall was covered with charts of her body, pulse rates, skin temperature fluctuations, recorded weights, even the frequency of her sighs. Evangeline had turned Catherine's very existence into a shrine of data. "My dear Catherine," Evangeline said softly, her voice thick with that poisonous maternal warmth. "Did you truly believe I didn't know about your writings? I have watched you as I've watched all of them. Every hope, every secret thought, every flicker of rebellion, it has all been part of my study. You are not my enemy. You are my finest subject." Her eyes glowed with a fanaticism that left no room for mercy. "Your essence will complete the great blooming. With you, the roses will outlast eternity." But Catherine, trembling though she was, refused to be reduced to another specimen. She drew on the very skills Evangeline had forced into her observation precision control. She matched her mistress's clinical tone, meeting madness with logic. "Your methodology is fundamentally flawed," she said evenly, her heart pounding so loudly she feared it would give her away. "There is no control group, no validation, no reproducibility. How can you call this science? At best it is obsession, at worst it is murder." The word struck like a blade. Evangeline's mask of rationality shattered in an instant, replaced by raw, unrestrained fury. "You ignorant creature," she shrieked, her voice cracking through the stone chamber. "You think your peasant mind can measure what I have built? 5 years I have perfected this work, 5 years of sacrifice of genius, and you dare to question it." Her body shook as the fury consumed her. The careful choreography of her experiment unraveled the timing, the instruments, the eclipse all forgotten in the storm of her rage. Catherine pressed the wound deeper. "Look at this room," she said, her voice rising as she gestured at the bottles, the charts, the obscene diagrams. "This isn't science. This is grief. This is madness. You murdered 11 girls not for progress, but because you were too weak to let go of your husband. You built a graveyard and called it a garden. What followed was chaos. Evangeline lunged with feral strength, striking clawing, screaming words that dissolved into inarticulate rage. But in her fury, she lost what Catherine had counted on her precision. The careful apparatus toppled bottles, shattered crimson fluid, soaking the floor in streaks that looked like blood. Charts ripped from the walls. Years of research scattered and destroyed in moments. For the first time, Evangeline Crowe was not the cold, calculating mistress of Willowbrook. She was simply a broken woman flailing in the ruins of her own delusion. And Catherine, bruised and gasping, understood that this collapse was the chance she had been waiting for. The great blooming never came to pass. In the end, Evangeline Crowe did not perish under the light of a lunar eclipse, nor through the intricate rituals she had so carefully planned. Her reign ended in the chaos of a struggle she could not control. Catherine Walsh, hardened by months of forced labor, managed to turn her mistress's own instrument against her. What followed was not the precise culmination of a theory, but a desperate act of survival. Evangeline's death was brutal, simple, and final. And in that moment, the chain of murders that had claimed 11 young lives was broken. But Willowbrook still had one last horror to reveal. As Catherine stumbled through the wreckage of the laboratory, she found a hidden cache of correspondence beneath the main workbench letters that widened the nightmare far beyond the walls of the plantation. Evangeline had not been a solitary madwoman. She had been part of a network of botanists, physicians, and wealthy planters from Virginia, South Carolina, and Georgia. They called it agricultural optimization through biological resource management, a sterile phrase that masked atrocities. In truth, it was systematic murder disguised as innovation, an exchange of methods for using human vitality to feed crops. Evangeline's research, horrific as it was, had merely been a pilot project. The letters suggested something even darker, that enslaved populations across the South were intended to become the raw material for a wider campaign of experimentation. When Thomas Hartwell arrived hours later, drawn by Catherine's screams echoing across the night, he found a basement that testified to years of hidden crimes. Bottles shattered across the floor, crimson fluid soaking into the earth, charts torn from the walls, all evidence that his father's warnings had been true. With Catherine's testimony and the records she had preserved, the truth was undeniable. But the correspondence also made clear that Willowbrook was just one piece of a sprawling conspiracy. Local authorities faced something far more dangerous than the crimes of a single plantation mistress. They faced proof that pillars of Southern society, men of wealth, science, and medicine, had lent their names and reputations to a doctrine of murder. Exposing Evangeline was one thing. Confronting the network behind her threatened the very foundations of antebellum power. And so when the investigation concluded, the most damning records were sealed under court order, locked away for 75 years. For Catherine's survival meant inheriting a burden as heavy as the graves that dotted Willowbrook's fields. Her testimony preserved the truth of Evangeline Crowe's descent into madness and her grotesque garden of roses. Yet it also revealed the larger truth that Willowbrook was not an aberration, but a symptom of something woven into the fabric of plantation society itself. The official histories would bury it, the courts would seal it, but the roses that once bloomed in impossible perfection carried a legacy written in blood. Evangeline Crowe's death should have ended the nightmare. But the correspondence hidden in her laboratory revealed something far worse. She had not acted alone. Her so-called network extended well beyond individual planters to include representatives from agricultural colleges, medical schools, and scientific societies. These institutions, cloaked in the respectability of education and progress, had quietly encouraged her work under the sanitized phrase, biological resource optimization. Behind that language lay an unspoken acceptance of human sacrifice in the name of agricultural innovation. Dr. Samuel Hartwell, his reputation restored by the discoveries of his son Thomas, spent the remainder of his life exposing what he could. His private papers, later donated to the Virginia Historical Society, documented injuries and unexplained deaths across plantations in central Virginia, each echoing the methods first exposed at Willowbrook. These records suggested Evangeline had not been an anomaly, but a node in a broader pattern of systematic abuse. The roses themselves, once hailed as the eighth wonder of the agricultural world, withered within weeks of their mistress's death. What investigators uncovered shocked even hardened physicians. The soil was laced with a lethal mixture of blood, poisonous plant extracts, and industrial chemicals. It was this crimson slurry, pressed into the servants' bare hands, that had produced both the grotesque beauty of the roses and the deaths of so many young women. The contamination was so severe that nothing grew on Willowbrook's land for nearly a decade. Catherine Walsh lived, but the ordeal marked her forever. She eventually married Thomas Hartwell and moved to Philadelphia, where she devoted herself to organizations working for domestic labor reform. Her testimony, though never publicly tied to Willowbrook, helped shape some of Pennsylvania's earliest protections for household servants. Her private writings describing in harrowing detail the systematic murders became the hidden foundation for a movement that gave future generations the safeguards she and her companions had been denied. Willowbrook Plantation itself was left to rot. The estate's reputation was so stained by whispers of curses, arson, and the undeniable contamination of its grounds that it was abandoned after the investigation. The once proud mansion stood empty for 40 years before being demolished in 1890. Its bricks and timbers scattered, its history deliberately erased. But the greatest horror lay not in the abandoned house or poisoned soil, but in the suppression of truth. Though Evangeline's records clearly implicated prominent names across the South, only 3 individuals were ever brought to trial. The others, wealthy landowners, respected physicians, learned botanists, were quietly warned and shielded from public disgrace. The cover-up was swift and effective, enabled by the same social hierarchies that had allowed the crimes in the first place. In a world where immigrant girls and orphan servants were seen as disposable, their disappearances were dismissed as accidents or neglect. Modern historians working through the once sealed court documents now believe that Evangeline's network may have been responsible for the deaths of hundreds of young women across the antebellum South. Many of those victims remain nameless immigrants, orphans, the poor, erased both by time and by deliberate destruction of evidence. What survives is a chilling lesson in how easily murder can masquerade as progress, and how quickly society can bury its own sins beneath the veneer of respectability. Catherine's final journal entry, written a half-century after she escaped Willowbrook, still stands as the truest epitaph for the girls who never left its grounds. She wrote that the roses once hailed as miracles of beauty were nothing more than monuments to human evil, masquerading as scientific progress. Every flawless petal had been fed by a stolen life. Every intoxicating fragrance carried the essence of innocence destroyed. And those who once praised Evangeline Crowe's garden as a wonder of the age had in truth been celebrating one of the most methodical chains of murder in American history. Willowbrook itself is gone now. Its exact location remains unmarked, its coordinates deliberately erased from official records to prevent morbid curiosity. In Henrico County, whispers still surface questions about the legendary garden that once drew crowds from across the South. But only a handful of historians who have combed through the sealed court documents know the full truth. And perhaps the most chilling part of this story is not what happened, but what it reveals about us. The conditions that allowed Evangeline's crimes exploited workers with no protection. The blind prestige of science, the isolation of wealth, the deference given to the powerful have existed in different forms across every chapter of American history. The rose garden at Willowbrook may have withered and died, but the danger of progress built on cruelty is always with us. So what do you think? Could such systematic evil really have been hidden so completely? Leave a comment and let me know what other buried mysteries from America's past you'd like to see uncovered. If you found this story haunting and want to hear more of the forgotten nightmares history has tried to bury, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share this with someone who loves the darker truths beneath our nation's brightest facades. The shadows of history are deep and filled with secrets, and together we will bring them into the light. Join me next time when we'll explore another dark chapter from America's hidden past.